This past month was Swordtember. If you're not familiar with Swordtember, it's basically a drawing challenge where you follow a list of prompts put out by different artists. You can choose one, and the idea is to draw or model or create a sword every month. I did a total of 2 swords the entire month, and we're going to talk about one of them today. I just wanted to walk you through some UVs and hand painting for creating a sword. Now, I've done a hand painted sword tutorial in 3dCoat in the past, about a year and a half ago. So this is going to kind of be a companion to that video. It's not going to be as in-depth in the absolute basics of 3dCoat that video was, but I wanted to just show you some technique and a bit of my thought process while I'm painting in 3dCoat, as well as maybe some tips and tricks that you can employ to speed things up or just kind of change up your workflow that we might not have gone over in that previous video. In addition to that, before we jump in, I'm going to add this sword and the textures for it to the free hand-painted Gumroad download that we have on the other one. So if you've already downloaded that one before, you can go download the updated version and it will have this sword in that folder. So you'll have the original sword and then this new one. And maybe as we do more weapons or we do more hand-painted stuff, I'll continue to add to that. So it'll be kind of like a living free asset and resource for you guys to download. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, very quickly before we jump into the hand painting, I wanted to just show a time lapse of the UVs for this sword. I decided not to show the modeling because it's a pretty basic model. If you're interested in seeing how I model low poly stuff in Maya, leave a comment and maybe that's something we can do. But I really just wanted to focus on the hand painting for the most part for this video. Now, usually when I UV anything, what I'll do is go through, click every element, and I'll just do a basic planar projection. That just ensures that the mesh has UVs if it doesn't already. Sometimes like things get messed up on import or export, you'll lose UVs, which is a very weird scenario. So I just do a quick planar projection on everything. And then I go through and I start unfolding everything. So just choosing my seams and unfolding. In this case, the sword is going to be mirrored on both sides. So as long as you delete everything on one half of the sword, you basically have the UV seams already done for you and you can just unfold. Obviously, if there's any tension in areas, you could add a little extra cut to relieve tension or make sure that your UVs are square. Since we're painting in 3D, it doesn't really matter that much, but it's good to have, clean UVs. Once you have everything laid out, it's just a matter of your good old fashioned, puzzle, pack them in as tight as possible. And you can just see me here playing with some arrangements and trying to figure out what works best in terms of packing everything in. I eventually find a solution that I'm happy with. So just take some time. I actually really enjoy the packing UV part. I think it's kind of fun to try to figure out what's the best arrangement or what's the most optimized arrangement. Just sort of a fun part of the process, I think. And then we have our UVs and we can export it as an OBJ. Jump over to 3dCoat and start hand painting. I'm going to be painting at a 2K resolution, so 2048 by 2048. This is pretty high for hand painting, I would say, but I wanted to have some fun and just practice with noodling some detail. So that is the resolution that I chose. The very first thing that I'm going to do is basically just create some basic material IDs by just establishing each of my layers in my scene. So I'm going to set up a gold layer, and then I'm going to add a layer for my metal, for my gems, and for my cloth straps. So that way I just kind of have rough layers that I can work on everything with and keep it neat and orderly the best that I can. Eventually I start to just build on top of it. This kind of depends on if you're texturing for production or if you're just texturing for yourself. The amount of headaches that might happen down the road. Obviously, the cleaner you keep things, the less headaches you have in the future. You need to make color variations if you need to go back and edit something. So that's always good to keep in mind in terms of keeping your layers orderly and organized when you're working. Now, the first new trick that I want to show you guys that we did not go over in the original video is just making a very simple light map inside of 3dCoat. You could also make a light map in like Marmoset or Maya or anything else, but we're going to do it right in 3dCoat. So I'm just going to show you my workflow for that. If you go up to Edit and choose Light Baking Tool, you'll see this little menu pops up. We're just going to keep the settings default, and if you just hit Bake, you'll see that it'll process for a moment, and then we'll get a result. And what you'll notice is that in our scene right now, it looks super scuffed. Everything's kind of dark, and some areas are dark, some areas are light. It just doesn't look very good. And I think that's because we are mirroring our UVs in a lot of spots. And in my experience, when you have mirrored UVs and you try to do baking, sometimes you get issues and stuff. And so I'm going to create a version of this mesh that's just the half geometry on the mirrored side. And then we're going to bake that, and then we'll import that back into our texture scene and use the result from that. So I'm going to open up a fresh 3D coat scene and import a model of the sword that is just half of the sword. So there's no stacked UVs, if that makes sense. You can see we just have a clean half model sword. Now, something to keep in mind is that the light direction for the light baking tool in 3dCoat is based off of the render room, I think is what it's called. And so if we go ahead and choose the render tab, we get this kind of option where it's rendering the sword, or it's trying to like do processing on it. And over on the right hand side, we have extra lights. And we can play with these sliders and settings to set the placement of the light that we want to bake. And so I'm going to kind of play with the settings and just set the light over to like the slight side top angle, just so we get somewhat of an angle on the light that adds some interest and will allow us to have some information when we go to paint our highlights and try to make some decisions about our lights and our shadows and all that good stuff. Once we're happy with that result, we can go back to edit, light baking tool, bake it out, and it's going to create a new layer with our light map. And that's just going to give us a lot of really great information to work with when we start texturing. And so now we need to go ahead and bring this back into our main scene. The way we can do that is we just go up to texture and we go to export, and you can just export a map, call it light map. And then we can open up our old scene and we just go to texture import it in, and it'll add it as a layer up top. And then you just have to choose what kind of blending mode that you want to do. You could do a multiply. I think I do a soft light just because it kind of colors it a little bit, but you can play with the different blending modes and see which one you like. And then from there, you can decide how you want to start texturing. You could start texturing underneath your light map, or you could start texturing above it. You'll see that I do both. I start underneath, and then eventually once I want to start like adding bounce light and color and stuff, I'll add a layer on top of my light map and start texturing on top. So it just kind of depends how you want to work in that regard. Now that we have our base colors down and we have a light map to help guide us, I'm going to start just roughing in my highlights, because the highlights are going to help us understand the direction of our light and understand how we should put down our shadows and other elements. So I'm just very roughly beginning to block in some of those highlights, figure out the colors, that sort of thing, and just kind of get a general direction and a general flow of how I want to take this asset. At this stage, I'm not really concerned about my strokes or it being super clean. I kind of purposely want my strokes to be really rough, because all that rough paint that I put down will help me find little details and find little surface definition for the material as I render it further. And really, when you're hand painting, it's just kind of this combination of soft brush strokes and hard brush strokes, and balancing those two together to get a nice result. Instead of trying to like logically figure out how to put that stuff down, you can kind of just discover it through your strokes. So if you just start kind of putting down rough strokes, you'll start to see shapes that'll give you ideas of how to kind of flesh out your detail and your micro surface detail. We're just looking at the big picture in a rough way that will enable us to actually kind of discover our micro detail and our more nuanced detail later on when we get to that stage. I'm also just trying to figure out my general color palette right now. I know that I want this to be kind of like a night elf, high elf type of sword, so I'm going for that like gold, fancy trim. You'll see me throughout this video play with the colors a lot, and you can just go up to texture, adjust, hue, saturation, value, and that's a very quick way to adjust the colors in 3dCoat. And you'll see because of that, I'm not immediately putting down other colors into my texture. Like, I'm keeping everything pretty monochrome right now in terms of their value, just so I can focus on what are the main colors. And then later on in the process, I begin to add, you know, some greens or reds or yellows or just kind of different hues subtly into the colors to kind of bring them to life and add some more visual interest. And here's me just playing with the gold, trying to figure out what works. Going a little darker, a little more saturated. I'm not really sure yet. Just trying to find colors that work together and kind of sing. You'll also see that during this highlight pass, I'm also outlining the edges and kind of getting the edges to pop, because those edges are what really help us get interesting definition and get interesting shadows and value structure between the light and the dark areas. So those are a really important aspect of it. When you're working on your edges, don't just have it be like an even lightness and an even thickness, because that'll get kind of boring. You kind of want to have it vary in value and vary in thickness and stuff like that. Almost like if you were doing an ink drawing, right? You kind of have this like flow and this rhythm to your line work. The same goes for your edges. You kind of want to pop them in areas where you might want to draw the viewer's eye, where you want more influence, and then towards like darker areas or areas that you don't want there to be as much focus, you can have the edges kind of taper off or become a little muddier. It just kind of comes with experimentation and seeing what works best for the asset. So I'm jumping from material to material. First, I did the gold. So now I'm doing the same thing for the metal on the blade. I'm going to let this part play out, and this is going to kind of make the video way longer than I anticipated. But I want to basically show you how I go about blocking in the detail for a material and how I kind of discover all the tertiary details and the subtle details in the material just from being rough and sloppy, and then kind of refining things as I discover them from my sloppy paintwork. What you'll notice immediately is that I'm doing a lot of these like directional strokes, highlights and dark areas and stuff like that through the whole thing. And those are going to kind of help give, a material feeling to the blade that I'm going for. Like it has this kind of rough directional edge along it. Throughout the process, you'll notice that I might go too hard on it, and then I'll just erase a bunch of it, and then I'll maybe add some back, and then I'll just erase a bunch of it. And I kind of go back and forth between trying to figure out what's too much detail and when is it feeling good or feeling right. And that's just this balancing act. And I apologize. That's why you see the time lapse zoom in and zoom out a lot, because I'm getting close to add some detail, but then I'm zooming back out to see if it feels right in terms of the bigger picture. And that results in this kind of like spasmy, but you really need to be able to do that. And I think a better working habit would be to try to get used to painting from a little further away, because how often are you really getting that close? You're only ever getting super close if it's like a portfolio piece and you're doing a close up or it's for some very specific purpose. But truthfully, most things we see at a distance, we might be looking at them on our phone. So if things look good and believable from far away, you might not need to spend a ton of time rendering it super up close. I do have a bad habit of getting a little too close to my assets sometimes while I'm working on them. But that's something you should think about and keep in mind as you're developing your workflow. Over time, as you hand paint different assets and you get more comfortable hand painting, you kind of build up a library of like details or techniques that you use over and over again. And you'll see that in my work here. I have a very specific way that I do like damage and dings. And once you know how to paint those, it's just a matter of where to put them and how to balance them on the overall piece. But the process is always the same time and time again. I like building this like half diamond dark area, building a lighter half diamond under area, hitting the edges of the ding with highlights. And that's kind of like the whole process. And you'll see that even with like, I add these little like circle details that are almost like raised areas of the blade. That's just like a little detail that I think looks cool that I use over and over again. And you'll find little details and techniques as you hand paint stuff and practice more that will just kind of become part of your hand painting library that you'll be able to use. And sometimes you'll notice that you're using them too often or you need to change it up. And then that's kind of when you grow and learn new things and find new styles. But you always have to start somewhere. And especially in production, when you have to like bang stuff out, it's good to have a library of techniques and ways you do things that you can use to get stuff done and still look really good. Like I mentioned earlier, when I'm kind of just roughing in those big brush strokes just to get some highlights or some shadows just kind of blocked out, I'm looking for soft areas and hard areas. And those are like little details that I can accentuate to create the illusion of what kind of material that I'm trying to render. So if we're trying to render this metal, you can see that we're trying to do it where it's kind of used and worn and it has depth and layers to it. And so sometimes I'll find like hard I'll find like a hard darker spot that I put in, and then I'll kind of like outline the edge of it against a highlight to really push it to make it look like it's darker. And then I might add some soft areas and then jot in some harder areas and then some soft areas, and then keep it kind of flat or not much detail for a little bit. So just giving it room to breathe and just kind of finding what works. I think in some areas on this piece, I did end up over detailing a little bit. Like, you're like, oh man, I'm hand painting. I need to hand paint a lot. But the truth is, letting stuff breathe and letting stuff not have detail can sometimes give you a better result in the end rather than like detailing and like hand painting the shit out of everything to the 10,000th degree. So, you kind of have to have restraint sometimes, and it can be really hard to do, but it just comes with practice and experience and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. And that goes for like highlights and stuff too. I think that it's really alluring to want to just hit highlights all over the place because they like really pop and they make the asset stand out. But as a result, things can tend to look really blingy and also tend to lack focus. Your highlights are where your viewer's eye is going to get drawn to. So if you really focus those highlights in key places and keep directionality and keep believability to them, it's going to make your asset feel so much better. Even if that means there's large areas where it's mostly flat or doesn't have highlights, when you pull back and look at the overall thing, it's going to look so much more believable and have so much more convincing materials that it'll feel much better than just like hitting highlights here and highlight there and highlight there. It takes a lot of restraint, just like the micro detail. Now, one of the other major tricks that I wanted to show in this video is being able to paint in a different program and send it back to 3dCoat. I can't remember if we went over this in the original video. I didn't go back and watch it, but even if not, it's a good refresher. And there's two ways you can go about doing this. One is you can send just the flat texture over to, say, Photoshop, paint on that, and then send it back. Or you can do a projection. So you can actually line up your camera, send a projected image over to Photoshop, noodle on it, and then send it back. So let's go through both of those methods and just see how they work. So you can go up to Edit. You can do Edit All Layers and External Editor. Now you're going to have to link a program. So I have Photoshop linked. I'm pretty sure you can do this with other 2D painting software. I haven't tried it myself, so don't take my word, but I'm pretty sure it works with other programs. And you can see it opens up the flat texture in Photoshop. And you can actually just add a layer or choose a layer and begin painting on it. And then whatever edits or painting you do in Photoshop, when we just hit Control Save and Alt Tab back over to 3dCoat, we're going to have all of those changes that we made in Photoshop. And this can be really useful if you just want to make some specific changes to your flats, or you're just trying to change things a little more easy, especially with like color tweaking and stuff. It's just easier to do in Photoshop than it is in 3dCoat. There's no way around it. If you want to do like gradient maps or anything like that, just much easier. Now, The other thing that's really cool that I don't use enough in my workflow, but I really should, is the projection method. So you can go up to edit and do edit projections in external editor, and it's going to take a snapshot of your camera and open that up in Photoshop. And you can see when ours right now opened up in Photoshop, it looks super scuffed. And that's because it puts a light map layer on top. And because we're just hand painting flat textures, the light map is super crazy looking because it has the depth information that we've been painting, because I forgot to turn depth off. It's a bad habit of mine. You can look at the comments in my other video to confirm that. But anyways, so you can just turn that off and add a layer. And now we can just start painting on this projection. And then when we save it and go back to 3dCoat, it's going to project all this detail from the camera projection onto the model, which is really cool. This is really useful if you're having trouble getting like a certain angle, or because of your normals, it's just hard to paint on like the edge of a surface or on like the edge of the blade, stuff like that, or you're just trying to get to a hard to reach area, or you're just not super comfortable painting in 3dCoat, but you're super comfortable painting in Photoshop. It's a super awesome way to work, and I definitely recommend giving it a try. At this stage, we've pretty much gone over all the major elements in terms of, hand painting this piece. Now it's just adding in more contrast, more depth to everything. So pushing the shadows. You'll see me continuously building up the highlights, adding brighter and brighter colors and kind of shifting away from that mid-tone. So I chose to go for like, a fairly dark mid-tone on my gold, for example. And then as my highlights built up, I pushed those highlights to be more and more yellow because I thought it gave kind of a nice contrast to the gold and really makes the highlights stand out. And you can see when I was doing those highlights, you can really see how like areas of the highlights are kind of soft. And then I do kind of like this swoopy line shape on the really hottest part of the highlight. And I just think that's an interesting detail. And then sometimes I might kill it, or I'll have it be soft on one side and hard on the other side. And all those little things help sell what kind of material you're trying to render, and also just create visual interest. If it's all just soft or all just hard, those are stylistic choices you can make, but it might not look as interesting. So balancing those kind of things. And we didn't go over it in the beginning, but I'm literally just using like the hard circle brush in 3dCoat. So if you went to panels and opened up the brushes, you can see by default there's a soft brown brush. I'm just using the hard one, and it's probably good practice to maybe add in some different brushes if you need like texture or try different methods. But I mean, truth be told, I kind of like just using the hard circle brush and feel like I can do a lot with it. But having more brushes and more versatility is just going to make you a better painter if you get really good at different kinds of brushes. Well, let's take a look at painting the big centerpiece of this, which is that giant gem right in the middle. And once you kind of hand painted a couple fantasy gems, the process is the same for all of them, for better or worse. We all have kind of agreed there's like a certain style to gems when you're doing hand painting, and that's this like underlit, almost kind of glowy bottom half with like hot highlights on the top. So I'm going in and I'm just painting in some darker blues around the edges and just kind of blocking in a general rounded shape by having the edges be darker and the center be lighter. And then I'll go in with a kind of different shade of blue turquoise on the bottom and start to make it feel like it's being underlit from the bottom. You can see that starting to come in. And then I'll make the top much darker, so you get that contrast of the dark up top and then the lighter underlight coming in. And then once we put those highlights on the top half, they'll really stand out in contrast to the darker area that we've painted underneath. And you can see for this gem, I'm being really, really rough with my strokes. Like, I'm not blending it at all. I'm keeping them very rough and just kind of very spotty and blotchy because I wanted it to be very hand painted feeling and very fantasy feeling. Obviously, if we wanted to really, really render it, I could smooth that stuff out, have it be super clean. But I like the idea of this being pretty rough. I just thought it would be a cool style, especially because I wasn't trying to spend a ton of time on this. This was like a sword temper sword that was meant to just be a quick exercise. So I was playing around with this kind of more rough loosey-goosey style, and I like how it turned out. For the highlights, there's two major components to think about. One is the actual main hot highlight, so I'm basically just hitting it with a hot white brush, or you could kind of tint it a little bit, so you could do like a light baby blue, or just give it a bit of color. You can play with that. Mine's mostly white, I think, slightly off white. And then I'm kind of just softening an edge of it, blending it in a little bit. And then I hit like a couple other little hot highlights just to show that the surface isn't perfectly smooth. It's like pop marky and might be a little rough. And then what I do is a second very low opacity white highlight where I do a big white spot like on the upper half of the gem, keep it pretty solid, and then just drop the opacity super, super low. And this just gives the effect that there's like a sheen or like an outside layer on top of whatever's going on inside that gem. And then you can actually go in and like erase some parts of it, like there's scratches or blemishes to the finish. And it just kind of gives this convincing multi translucent feeling to the gem that I think works really well. Now I'm going to start really trying to add more life and more nuance to the materials to make everything kind of sing and blend together. So you'll see I'm adding bounce light from that gem, just kind of blue bounce light around the gold, just trying to make it seem like the materials are interacting with each other in some way. I'll also start adding bounce light to the gold itself. So I'll go kind of crazy with it and do like an orangey color for the bounce light on the gold to just give those shadowed areas more life and more color, because right now they feel very flat and monochromatic. And I think that helps it just kind of sing. And then on the metal for the blade, I'll go in with just a really low opacity and I'll add in like reds, yellows, greens, those sorts of things. And then you can have actual color variation. So for example, if your gold has like patina, you could do like a greenish color and just fill in that greenish color like in the corners or the crevices or on the tips, and just kind of give it a interesting patina or like oxidation, if it's bronze or something like that, and just gives you more depth and interest to your material. Same like on the blade, you could do a reddish rust and just hit that in like the cracks or the crevices, hit it along the edges, that sort of thing, and just kind of give you a lot of material interest to your surfaces. One of the last elements that I hadn't rendered yet is the strap, and I'm just showing you why I left the UVs not mirrored, because I wanted there to be this kind of wrapping gold piece all the way around. I probably could have just mirrored it and they would have just been gold rings, but I wanted it to be a continuous looping gold circle, which was kind of a pain in the ass. But yeah, I like how it turned out, so I left it. Here you can really see how much just adding that kind of bounce light of the gold, like those orange hits in the shadow areas, add to the overall like vibrance and life of the piece. It was still feeling kind of flat, but as soon as you start adding in some of those bounce colors and secondary colors, things start to really come alive and it starts to feel more cohesive because those materials are beginning to interact with each other in some way. I think I could have gone even harder on the actual blade. The secondary like skittle colors that I added to the blade were pretty subtle. And I could have gone way more crazy. That would be a critique that I would give myself in this case. Another critique I think I would give myself is maybe some of it I over-rendered or pushed too hard. I think there's some areas where I would loosen it up a little bit. Some areas where I think the edge wear got a little, some areas where I think the edge highlighting got a little too thin. Especially when you consider, we got to zoom back and look at that whole thing like we talked about in the beginning of this video. Keeping those edges nice and chunky, that sort of thing. Obviously, that's a style choice depending on, what the art style is that we're going for. But I knew that I did want those edges to be fairly big and soft. So a little too thin in parts. I would go back and edit that. But overall, I was pretty happy with the way this turned out. I wish I had the opportunity to do more swords for Sword Timber. Obviously, it's like Sculptober now, which I will probably not do anything for. I'd like to think I'm going to do a Halloween piece. I think last year I said I was going to do a whole Halloween Necromancer character that I never finished. Right now I'm working on an entire character series for Zangief, which is why you haven't seen many videos of me this year. I've been trying to do a front-to-back character series but I really got hung up on the idea that I had to have the character completely finished before I filmed the first video, because I really want to be able to show you guys the final asset up front rather than like the journey. So that took me way longer than I thought, but I realized I need to just start making shorter videos on random topics. So if there's anything you guys want to see, give me a comment in the comment section below. If you're looking for ZBrush tutorials, hand painted tutorials, whatever, we'll try to bang out some smaller tutorials and smaller walkthroughs. And also maybe just more game industry topics too that I think I'd like to start discussing more. You know, AI and the recent layoffs and just a lot of things that are happening in the industry. I have some opinions about, so maybe we'll try to get into some of that. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.